Why talk about trauma? Because trauma is behind just about every psychological issue, just about every mental health issue and disorder, be it depression, anxiety, which by the way is on the rise, especially amongst young people. And in one of the future videos, I'll talk about that and as to why that's happening. Borderline personality disorder, which is also another thing that we see more and more frequently, especially amongst young women. Bipolar disorder, ADD, addiction, you name it. Now, being a psychotherapist with a clinical psychology background, obviously I'm talking about trauma, but trauma is not the only contributing factor to developing those disorders. And that's one thing I've actually discovered lately in the last 2 decades, maybe, because in the past I used to believe it was just trauma, just pure environmental factor. Now I'm realizing more and more that there's also the nature factor, such as your genetic predisposition, your microbiome, which is the proportion of the bad and good microorganisms in you, environmental toxins. All these other factors play actually a role in developing a mental health disorder. But again, because of my background, I'm going to talk about trauma only. But in fact, it really is a matter of the perfect storm, when all those factors combine together trigger a response in a person. So when we think about trauma, most of us think about a major catastrophic event, such as being assaulted or being in a war or being in a natural disaster situation. And surely enough, those are very severe traumatic events, which will definitely, inevitably affect a person's mental health. However, what I want to talk about more is the disguised trauma, the more subtle form of trauma that most of us wouldn't even think in terms of trauma. And it's helpful to know why we are struggling with whatever we might be struggling with, whether it's, as I said, ADD or depression, whatever it is. It's helpful to understand where that comes from, at least from the psychological point of view. Trauma can be so disguised and so subtle, like, for example, especially in the early formative years, in the early childhood, when we are just being formed as personality. For example, a child who's frequently criticized by a perfectionist parent who is otherwise very loving and caring. And so it's like a grain of sand upon a grain of sand upon a grain of sand, and soon enough you get a dune of trauma. Or even worse, even more subtle and more disguised, and I'm like what happened to me. I'm going to share with you what happened to me. Being a trauma specialist by really some strange divine design, it's not what I chose necessarily. I have always specialized in personal relationships and family relationships. However, after getting my clinical psychology qualification back home in former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia now, and working there for about 7 years, during the war in Bosnia, my husband, Ivan, ended up in England, and then I retrained again to become registered as a clinical psychotherapist and psychologist. And after about 9 years of working there, working for the National Health Service and being in private practice and teaching at university, we ended up in Canada about 19 years ago in Vancouver, where we live now. By the way, this is about 3 hours drive from Canada, what you're seeing behind. We are in Lillooet, my husband and I, camping now, which we often do after our monthly workshops, which we run, and we go to the nature to recharge. We just finished one of our workshops called Magic Witnessing Meditation Ceremony, which you can find about that more if you go on my Facebook or even on Spirit Plant Medicine Facebook. Anyway, not to digress too far about that. being a trauma specialist I became, as I said, somehow by default a trauma specialist, because my clients, several of my clients whom I helped, told their doctors, so those doctors started sending me more clients with trauma, and some of those clients have been in accidents and had injury lawyers, so those lawyers started sending me clients. So I ended up at some point, literally, my practice was full, mine and my associates, just with clients with explicit, obvious trauma. So I became known as a trauma specialist. I moved away from that a little bit more. I still work with trauma, but I like now to work more with other issues, especially people who are more advanced in terms of self-actualization and want to go deeper. That's what I'm passionate about now. So going back to having full practice of people who have trauma and want to resolve their trauma, I ended up traumatizing my own child, being a trauma specialist. And how did I do that? In such subtle ways, because I was working so hard all the time, and whenever I was free, I made sure every day I had plenty of time for my child, who was very little then. And I had hidden guilt because I loved working. And also I needed to work because my husband and I, coming from the war and starting from the beginning again and again, we wanted to provide wonderful life for our family. But there was a hidden guilt in me, and that guilt led me to be somewhat overprotective of our child or of our son, without even my noticing that. I would have noticed that in a client, and I would have told them. And I kept telling people how important it is not to be overprotective, not to be harsh, but not to be overprotective either. And yet I ended up being overprotective because I just wanted, to give him as much as possible when I was there. And in fact, that ended up being a form of trauma. Clearly not a very obvious form of trauma. But how did that traumatize him? Because by protecting him so much, I failed to allow him to develop his own resilience, to work on some issues by himself. By the way, I did not go totally crazy with it. It's again in a very subtle form, because I did, and my husband and I have been very aware of allowing him to grow his resilience, to grow his independence. Even when he was 9 months old or 7 months old, 7 months old, he started crawling. We took the gates off and supervised him with going up and down the stairs to help him learn to navigate the stairs so he wouldn't depend on the gates. So yes, we've done lots of good things, but also failed. I failed also in very subtle ways, which definitely affected him. So when he was a teenager, in late teens, he went through some personal struggles, which he's out of right now. And we've always had a great relationship. We've talked about that, and I apologized to him so many times. And he keeps saying, "Mom, are you crazy? That's not trauma. You have no idea what some people go through." I agree. We were not terrible parents, but I still incurred some damage there too. So I'm telling you that when you look for trauma, you need to look for those subtle and hidden traumas too, because they affect us too. How does the trauma affect us? Well, okay, so let me try to explain a little bit about the brain. So imagine that, sorry, my nose is itching a little bit here. I don't know, there must be something here in the nature. Normally I don't have allergies. So imagine your brain looking a bit like this, consisting of two hemispheres. And this brain around this is your frontal cortex under the skull. And that's your smart brain, that's your computer, that's your thinking brain. This brain's job is just like a computer, to process information. And it keeps processing information all the time, just like the computer. Even when we're sleeping, when we are dreaming, in that phase, the REM phase of sleep, we are actually, dreams are nothing but processing of the leftover information. So your computer is still working. So it's hugely important, obviously. Now, when I open my hand, you see this thumb around which the sophisticated smart brain is wrapped around, that part of the brain, and I'll really simplify this, I'm not going to use any medical or professional jargon, is that's your survival brain. Now that survival brain normally is dormant, it's sleeping in optimal life situation, okay? But when we are in a situation that our smart brain perceives as unsafe, and that again doesn't have to be a huge thing, being criticized, even a small criticism, or being tiny, being 2 years old and thinking you have monsters under your bed, and telling your parents, and your parents say, enough, don't try to, you're just trying to stay up as long as possible. Go to bed, lights off. And in your little 2-year-old brain, monsters are very real and you're horrified. That's traumatic for you. Even though it's just imaginary, monsters don't exist, but your brain doesn't know that. Even when you're watching a horror movie, you know as an adult that that's just a movie, it's not real. Your brain doesn't know it actually, because your brain still responds as if though something terrible is happening. Otherwise you wouldn't be getting scared and startled and close your eyes. And sometimes when we watch Game of Thrones, my husband and I would often close my ears, because the sound of horrible things happening to people is actually more traumatizing than seeing it. Try that. Try to close your ears and watch a horror movie. It won't be as bad, as nearly as bad. Maybe it'll be only 30% bad. It's interesting, right? How we operate, how our brains operate. Anyway, so what happens when your thinking brain perceives a potential danger, whether it's real or not, that's irrelevant. It activates the survival brain. It wakes it up. And to the extent that the survival brain is activated, your thinking brain deactivates itself to the same extent. So they work in inverted proportions, so that the energy goes to this brain. So when this brain, survival brain, takes over, it's not sophisticated like your thinking brain. It can't think, analyze, categorize, make decisions, all of those amazing things, deductive, everything that this brain does. It just does one of the three things. It literally prepares you for survival by either putting you in a fight response, or flight response, or freeze response. So it practically gives signals to the endocrine glands to prepare you to run away or fight back. If neither seems like a possibility, then you freeze. So it's fight, or freeze. So what happens then when you are in that fight, flight, freeze survival mode, your thinking brain's capacity is lowered, so that a traumatic event cannot be fully processed, because that's its function, to process everything. Everything is information. What you see, hear, taste, touch, body, sensations, thoughts, emotions, everything is information which your computers, your brain is constantly processing. Now, your brain cannot fully process that situation, so it processes some of it and the rest just gets stored somewhere here at the back of the brain. It just gets stored there as raw data, raw, unchewed, undigested, in order so that our thinking brain does not get flooded, so that we don't fall apart, so it doesn't fragment, so we don't go crazy. So that raw data sits there and it keeps accumulating through time. And that's why, and it can be until you reach a point where a straw breaks a camel's back. That's why it's important to go there and cleanse that and start resolving those trauma, so you don't end up with a huge mental health issue. How to resolve the trauma, we'll talk about that next time. In fact, my husband, Ivan Rados, or as people call him, Ivan Rados, and I have developed our own technique for trauma resolution that's been working miraculously with our clients. It's amazing. It works literally within minutes. And I will share that secret technique with you in one of my future videos. It's very easy. You can do it yourself, and it takes minutes only. Just stay tuned.